Margaret waited for the clock to whisper past midnight before she allowed herself to cry. The dark made her brave enough to be weak, and she trusted the silence not to tell. The house around her breathed in slow, aching creaks, as if it too remembered better days. The old lamp cast a trembling circle of light, soft against the wrinkles of her hands. In that faint glow, she held a photograph, her husband's smile frozen in time, while her own had long since faded. Tears slipped down without sound. Falling on the picture frame she pressed to her chest. She whispered his name as though it could reopen heaven for a second, but only the ticking clock answered. Every sound reminded her that she lived alone now, that her laughter had no witness. Sometimes she tried to pray, but the words tangled with her sobs until they were only breath. Even so, she kept whispering, afraid that if she stopped, God might forget she was still here. She rose to close the curtains tighter, as if the night outside might pity her if it saw. The window reflected her face, thin and lined with stories that no one asked about anymore. Once she had been surrounded by people, by music, by warmth. Now her world had shrunk to the space between her armchair and her bed. She sat back down, folded her hands, and listened to her own heartbeat filling the quiet room. There were moments when she thought of packing a small bag, of leaving everything behind and walking without direction. But even that took a kind of courage she no longer had. The weight of years and memory pinned her gently but firmly in place. So she stayed where love had ended, trying to keep its ghost company. The night stretched long before her, patient and unfeeling. When at last her tears slowed, she turned off the light, and darkness came to hold her. The room grew still, except for the steady rhythm of the clock that did not care who listened. Margaret lay on her side, one hand still on the photograph, her breath shallow and tired. She did not expect comfort, only rest. And in that fragile half-sleep, she drifted, unseen, unheard, but not yet forgotten. The morning light crept through the curtains like a hesitant visitor, soft and golden, yet unwelcome. Margaret sat still in her armchair, listening to the groan of the wooden floorboards beneath her slippers. The house, once filled with voices and laughter, now spoke only in sighs and echoes. Dust danced in the air where sunlight touched it, tiny ghosts swirling in silence. Everything here remembered, even when she wished it would forget. On the mantel rested the clock her husband had wound every evening, its hands still ticking faithfully toward nowhere. She had thought once of stopping it, letting time stand still, but could not bring herself to silence its heartbeat. The sound was all that tied her to what once was life. Dinners for two, quiet hymns on Sundays, his low voice reading aloud. Every object had its place, untouched since the day he left for the hospital. She lived among relics of love, afraid to move even one. Sometimes she would pause by the doorframe and touch the marks scratched into the wood, the faint notches that marked years of birthdays, of their son's growing height. Her son lived far away now, sending postcards when he remembered, always signing "Love David" in neat, distant letters. Margaret smiled at those cards, but they hurt more than they healed. She pinned them to the refrigerator anyway, pretending the paper could replace presents. The house, she thought, was a museum no one visited. At dusk, she wandered into the kitchen and filled a kettle, the ritual unchanged after decades. The whistle rose sharp, breaking the silence for a moment, and she poured the tea with trembling hands. The same 2 cups, one hers, one his, sat on the table, though one remained empty. She spoke into the emptiness, her voice barely above a whisper, telling him about the weather, the garden, the ache in her knees. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered her, steady and indifferent. Later that night, she stood in the hallway and looked toward the closed door of their bedroom. The handle glinted faintly in the dim light, untouched since the day she folded his last shirt. She hadn't slept there since. Her heart could not bear the hollow on his side of the bed. Sometimes she pressed her ear against the wood, as though the silence might confess something. Perhaps that love still lingered inside. But the door never spoke, and neither did God. She carried a small duster in her hand, moving from shelf to shelf with slow, careful motions. It wasn't that she cared about cleanliness, it was the act of keeping something alive. The framed photographs, the books, the clock, all were her fragile congregation of memories. She whispered softly as she cleaned, like one offering prayers to the past. Every gesture was a plea. Don't let me vanish with him. The house felt different after dark. Its shadows seemed deeper, its corners wider, as if the emptiness expanded when night fell. Margaret sat once more in her armchair, the same one where he used to rest his hand on hers. The ticking clock became louder, counting what she no longer had. She thought of turning on the television, but the laughter of strangers hurt more than the quiet. So she chose silence. At least it didn't lie. Before sleep came, she rose to close the curtains and looked once toward the garden. The moonlight touched the wilted roses, their heads bowed as if in prayer. He had loved those flowers. She could almost see him kneeling there again, humming softly while trimming the leaves. A tremor passed through her chest, not quite pain, not quite peace. "Good night," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to him, the house, or to heaven itself. Once, this same house had echoed with joy. The sound of her husband's deep chuckle, the soft clatter of teacups, the footsteps of their son running down the hallway. It had been a place of warmth, of Sunday lunches, hymn rehearsals, and the smell of bread cooling on the counter. Now, that laughter lived only in memory, replaying faintly like an old record that skipped with time. The silence that replaced it was too perfect, too final. She often stood in the doorway of the dining room, seeing them there as they once were. Her husband reading aloud from the Bible, David pretending to listen, eyes wandering toward the window where sunlight fell. Margaret herself, younger, strong, full of purpose, her heart light, her voice steady. But the vision dissolved quickly, leaving only the wooden chairs, the empty plates, and her own reflection on the glass. She would turn away quickly, unable to bear the weight of what was gone. Sometimes the radio played by accident, when her trembling hand brushed the button. Old hymns or soft jazz would fill the air, and for a brief, aching moment, the walls seemed to breathe again. She would close her eyes and let the sound carry her back, to laughter shared over burnt toast, to whispered promises at night. But when the song ended, the silence returned sharper than before. The music had opened something in her that pain quickly reclaimed. Margaret wondered if joy had a season, and if hers had simply passed. She did not blame God, only time. For it was time that took her husband, time that carried her son away, and time that left her behind. She smiled faintly at her own thought. Perhaps laughter belonged to the young, and her season was winter now. Still, she longed for one more burst of light-heartedness, not to forget, but to remember that her heart could still be warm. In the early months after her husband's passing, neighbors came often. They brought casseroles, flowers, and gentle smiles that tried to fill the silence. But as the weeks became months, the visits thinned like mist in the morning sun. Margaret understood. Life moved on for others, even when hers had stopped. Soon, the knocks on her door became memories too. She began to measure time not by days, but by the distance between visits. The mailman's brief greeting felt like a feast of words. When the church ladies stopped by with leftover pie, she rehearsed small talk in her mind, terrified she might forget how to sound cheerful. And when they left, she stood by the window, watching them go, feeling the echo of footsteps fade like hope itself. One evening, she left her porch light on, a silent invitation no one answered. The bulb flickered through the night, throwing a tired glow across the empty steps. It reminded her of her own heart, still shining, but weaker each day. Sometimes she imagined someone passing by, pausing to wonder who lived there before hurrying on. Her loneliness became a kind of waiting that had no end. She thought about calling her son, but stopped each time. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to hear the hurried kindness in his voice. So she listened instead to the old refrigerator hum and pretended it was conversation. Loneliness had become her most faithful companion. It never forgot to visit. In its quiet way, it kept her from vanishing altogether. Late one night she whispered into the darkness, "If someone knocks, Lord, I'll open." The words surprised her. They felt like both a prayer and a confession. She wasn't sure if she meant a neighbor or something beyond this world. But when no sound came, she closed her eyes and smiled weakly. Even unanswered prayers, she thought, must still rise somewhere. Morning came slower now. Her bones ached with every movement, her hands trembling even when holding nothing. Once she had been proud of her independence, mowing her own lawn, baking bread for the entire block. Now even tying her robe felt like climbing a hill. She had begun to understand that strength was not forever, and yet she carried on, one gentle motion at a time. She moved through the house like a careful spirit, steadying herself on the furniture that had outlived everyone else. The mirror in the hallway showed a face she barely recognized, thinner, paler, framed with silver hair that caught the light like frost. There was still kindness in those eyes, though weariness shadowed it. She smiled at her reflection, a small act of defiance against the fading of her days. Her breath shortened when she climbed the stairs, but she refused to ask for help. Pride, she thought, was the last thing time couldn't take. Still, there were nights when she feared closing her eyes, wondering if she'd wake again. She prayed then, not for more years, but for peace when they ended. Her faith had grown quiet, less about words, more about waiting. Once she fell in the kitchen, slipping on a spilled cup of water. Lying on the cold tiles, she stared at the ceiling and laughed softly, though tears followed. "You really must be watching, Lord," she murmured, "because no one else is." She stayed there a long time before gathering the strength to rise. Somehow she did, and in that small victory, she felt seen. When she returned to her chair, her body throbbed with pain, but something inside her felt lighter. Maybe, she thought, fragility was its own kind of grace, a reminder that every heartbeat was borrowed and beautiful. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion carry her toward the afternoon stillness. The house was silent, but for once it didn't feel cruel. It felt like rest. That night, Margaret sat by the window, watching rain trace silver lines down the glass. She clasped her hands together, though her fingers ached from the chill. Words gathered slowly, uncertain and fragile, like a child afraid to speak. "I don't know what to say anymore," she whispered, "but I'm still here, Lord." It was not eloquent, but it was honest, and that was enough. She remembered the prayers of her youth, full of certainty and song. Back then, faith had been a melody, not a murmur, but now she prayed with silence more than with speech, her tears doing the talking her voice could not. Somewhere deep within, she hoped that heaven still understood the language of sorrow, that even small prayers, trembling as hers, could reach God's heart. For a long time she stayed still, listening to the rain. Its rhythm soothed her, each drop like a heartbeat against the roof. She thought of her husband, of his steady way of praying, his calm trust. She missed that, not just him, but the quiet confidence he carried. She had inherited his Bible, but not his certainty. Still, she opened it often, letting her fingers rest on the worn pages. Her eyes fell upon a verse she had read countless times before. "I have called you by name. You are mine." The words blurred through her tears. For a moment, she almost believed them were spoken aloud, meant for her in this very hour. She pressed the open book to her chest and closed her eyes, breathing the verse like oxygen. Something deep within her stirred, small but real. Outside, the rain softened to mist. The clock ticked on. Margaret felt a quiet calm settle where despair had been. It wasn't joy, not yet, but the faintest shadow of peace. Maybe, she thought, faith was simply staying long enough to be found. And so she did. Sitting by the window whispering, "I'm still here." Days passed, then weeks, without any sense of change. The prayers continued, soft and unseen, but heaven stayed silent. Margaret tried to convince herself that silence wasn't absence, though her heart doubted it. The air in the house felt thicker, heavier, as if time itself had grown tired of moving. Even her own thoughts came slower now, like footsteps sinking into sand. Sometimes she would speak aloud just to hear a voice, even if it was only her own. "It's a fine day," she'd say to the teapot, or "You've grown quiet," to the clock. She smiled at her own foolishness, yet the gestures comforted her. The world outside her window kept spinning, cars passing, children laughing in the distance, but none of it touched her world anymore. She lived in a stillness only faith could survive. At church, her seat in the back pew remained empty more often than not. The effort of getting dressed, of pretending strength, was too much. She watched the Sunday service from her window instead, listening faintly to the distant bells. They sounded like a promise from far away, one she wasn't sure she believed anymore. "Maybe heaven has its reasons," she whispered, though she longed to know them. One evening, the power went out, and darkness fell completely over her home. She lit a candle, its small flame trembling like her faith. Shadows stretched across the walls, long and uneven. In that quiet, she felt both her insignificance and her endurance. "If you're still near," she said softly, "please don't let me fade." The candle burned steady as if listening. By the time light returned, something inside her had settled. Not hope, but something close. The silence remained, but it no longer felt cruel. It had shape, weight, even tenderness. Perhaps God was not absent after all, but hidden in the very stillness she feared. She breathed deeply, let the quiet fill her lungs, and whispered, "I'm learning to wait." There were nights when Margaret sat with her hands open on her lap, as though waiting for a touch that would never come. Her fingers remembered what her heart dared not forget. The warmth of her husband's hand, the way he'd squeeze gently before saying grace. Memory had weight. It lived in her skin, in the folds of her palms, in the way she still turned halfway in bed expecting another presence. That emptiness beside her became both comfort and ache. It was love, preserved in absence. She began to speak to him sometimes, not out loud, but inwardly. In those small moments, the space around her seemed less empty, as if love lingered where breath had once been. She imagined his laughter, his small cough, the rustle of his newspaper. The mind, she thought, could be cruel, but sometimes it was merciful too. It allowed her to feel near what time had taken far away. One afternoon, she found his old scarf folded neatly in the drawer. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the faint scent that had somehow survived the years. It was enough to bring tears without pain, gentle tears, the kind that cleanse instead of break. She wrapped the scarf around her shoulders, not as protection from the cold, but as a gesture of remembrance. "You're still here," she whispered. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, she felt something stir within her chest. Not a presence she could see, but one she could sense. It was warmth, soft and steady, like a small flame refusing to die. She didn't move, afraid it might vanish if she did. Instead, she sat still, letting her tears fall freely, realizing that maybe love was never meant to leave entirely. Before sleep took her, she touched the pillow beside her and smiled faintly. "Thank you," she murmured, not knowing if she spoke to her husband, to memory, or to God. It didn't matter. The ache had softened, and peace had begun to breathe where pain once ruled. She turned off the light, feeling that for the first time in years, she was not entirely alone. But peace never stayed long. Days later, a heavy fog seemed to descend over her heart again. The mornings came grey and lifeless, her reflection in the mirror pale and tired. She found no reason to rise early. No one was waiting. No one would notice. Even the clock ticked slower, as if it shared her fatigue. Hope, she thought, had limits. There were moments when she wondered what would happen if she simply stopped trying. The thought frightened her, not of death itself, but of being forgotten even by heaven. She had seen too many winters, too many goodbyes, too much of the world's indifference. Faith felt distant, like a language she once spoke fluently but had forgotten the words to. She sat by the window and wept until her tears ran dry. One evening she did not light her lamp. She sat in darkness, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and her own heartbeat. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered into the void. The words fell flat, swallowed by the walls. No comfort came, no voice, no miracle. Only the steady, unbroken silence. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of her body sink deeper into the chair. In that depth of despair, something inside her cracked open, not in rebellion, but surrender. For the first time, she stopped trying to hold her life together. The grief was too vast to manage, so she let it come, wave after wave, until exhaustion became her only prayer. "If you still see me," she breathed, "then stay." The sentence was small, but it carried her whole soul. When she finally rose, her body was trembling, yet lighter. Something had shifted, not the world, but her. Despair had emptied her of strength, but it had also made room for something else, something she couldn't yet name. The night remained dark, but its darkness no longer felt endless. She sat quietly, breathing in the stillness, waiting for dawn. It came when she least expected, not in church, not in prayer, but in the quiet before sunrise. Margaret sat half awake in her chair when a sound, gentle as breath, stirred the silence. It wasn't from outside. It was within, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, saying only one thing: "You are not alone." Her eyes filled instantly with tears she hadn't known were waiting. She didn't move, afraid the sound might vanish like a dream. The air around her felt warmer, though no light had yet touched the room. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear but awe. "Who's there?" she whispered back, though she already knew. It wasn't a voice of this world. It was something that spoke straight to her soul, bypassing reason, awakening something long asleep. For a long while, she just sat there, trembling. The words echoed softly inside her. Not alone, not forgotten. She repeated them quietly, letting them settle into the corners of her being. It was as if a door had opened within her heart, one she had kept locked for too long, and through it flowed warmth, calm, presence. The whisper didn't return, but its memory remained. She rose slowly and walked toward the window where the first light of morning had begun to rise. The dawn looked different that day, not brighter but kinder. The world had not changed, yet she saw it anew, as if her eyes had learned to see through love again. She pressed her hand to the glass, smiling through her tears. "You came," she said softly. The words weren't for anyone human, and yet they felt heard. Somewhere between heaven and her small room, a bridge had formed, invisible but real, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt held. From that morning on, she carried something quiet and luminous inside her. It didn't speak often, but when it did, it was never loud. It came as thoughts she hadn't formed herself, tender, patient, full of peace. When fear whispered, "You are forgotten," another voice answered softly, "I never left." It was not imagination. She knew that now. It was presence. The days still looked the same old kettle, the same chair, the same empty garden. But within her, everything had shifted. Loneliness had not vanished, but it no longer ruled her. She could feel love pulsing through ordinary things, the warmth of the mug in her hands, the song of the sparrow outside. The sacred had moved into the simple. Sometimes she would close her eyes and breathe slowly, letting silence speak. In that stillness, she could almost sense him beside her, not as a figure, but as nearness itself. No need for visions, no words, just peace. It was as though the same Jesus she had sung about in her youth had finally stepped into her quiet, unremarkable days. One afternoon she whispered, "Why now?" The answer came not as sound, but as understanding. "Because now you can hear me." The realization made her weep, not from sadness, but from gratitude too deep for speech. She had thought silence was punishment. Now she saw it had been preparation. As dusk settled that evening, she lit a candle on the table and smiled. Its flame flickered gently, mirroring the new light within her. She wasn't healed of all pain, but she was no longer lost in it. She knew who held her, even when unseen. The voice within was steady, and she was learning to listen. That night, as the rain returned, Margaret felt a presence move through her home, not with footsteps, not with sound, but with gentleness. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't need to. Somehow, she knew that she was not alone. Her heart trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. Love had entered again. She sat in her chair and closed her eyes, her hands resting on her lap. The warmth she had felt that morning returned, surrounding her like a quiet embrace. She didn't see him, but she knew. Every inch of her being whispered, "He is here." The space that had felt so empty for years now felt full of presence, full of peace, full of something she could not explain. She began to weep softly, not out of sorrow this time, but release. All the nights of silence, all the prayers unanswered, all the longing, it all gathered in that moment and dissolved into stillness. There was no voice, no miracle, no vision, only love, and it was enough. The candle on the table flickered, bending toward her as though touched by breath. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "You found me." The words came without thought, rising from a place deeper than memory. She knew that this visit wasn't from the world she could see, yet it felt more real than anything else she had ever known. When she finally lay down, she left the candle burning. The flame glowed gently against the wall, steady, unwavering. She fell asleep with a peace she hadn't felt in decades, the kind that doesn't come from rest, but from being seen. The visitor had come without knocking, yet he had entered the door she had kept open all along. At dawn, Margaret awoke to a soft light filling the room. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but then she felt it, a gentle hand resting on her shoulder. It was warm, steady, reassuring. She didn't turn to look. She simply breathed it in, afraid to break the holy silence. The touch said what words never could: "You are safe, you are loved." Her body relaxed for the first time in years. The tension that had lived in her chest melted away like frost under sunlight. She felt small, but not insignificant, fragile, but not forgotten. Tears came again, yet they didn't sting. They healed. That simple, unseen touch became her anchor in a world that had long since lost shape. Time seemed to pause. The clock ticked faintly somewhere far off, but she didn't care. All that mattered was that someone, not of this world, was here with her. She whispered, "I missed you," and the air itself seemed to answer, a soft hush wrapping around her words. It was not a miracle of vision, but of nearness. She thought of how many nights she had begged for a sign, only to find it now in the smallest gesture, a touch, a stillness, a warmth. Perhaps God never shouts, she realized. Perhaps he only waits until we are quiet enough to feel him. And she had finally fallen silent enough. Her grief had become her gateway. When the feeling began to fade, she didn't panic. She knew now that presence wasn't gone, only unseen again. She placed her own hand over the shoulder he had touched and smiled through her tears. "Stay with me," she whispered. And though the room returned to ordinary light, she knew he would. For the first time in years, Margaret no longer feared silence. It no longer felt like emptiness, but like rest. She sat by the window each morning, letting the light spill gently across her face. The garden beyond was quiet, the world unchanged, yet within her something new was growing. Stillness had become her prayer. She began to see beauty where she once saw decay, the cracks in the wall, the faded curtains, even the dust that settled on the shelves. They all seemed to belong now, each a witness to her endurance. The house hadn't failed her. It had waited with her. She smiled softly, realizing she was not the only one being healed. The silence had done its work. When fear tried to return, the fear of being alone, of death, of being unseen, she closed her eyes and listened inward. And there it was again, that faint whisper, steady and sure, saying, "I am here." It didn't stop the pain entirely, but it held it, the way sunlight holds the chill of dawn. Love, she learned, doesn't erase pain. It transforms it. The days moved slowly but peacefully. She found herself humming again, the old hymns she used to sing beside her husband. Her voice was fragile, trembling, but it filled the air with warmth. The walls seemed to remember the sound. Sometimes she would laugh softly at herself, surprised that joy had found its way back in. Each night she thanked God, not in grand words, but in a breath. "Thank you for seeing me," she would whisper before sleep. The stillness would settle again, wrapping her in peace. The same stillness that once haunted her now healed her. And it was in that quiet that she began to truly live again. One morning Margaret woke before dawn, feeling a new kind of lightness in her chest. She drew in a long, deep breath, the kind she hadn't taken in years, and felt it fill her like sunlight. For a moment, she simply sat there, marveling at how good it felt to breathe without pain. Each breath was a prayer, each exhale a release. She smiled and whispered, "Thank you." She walked to the window and opened it wide. The air outside was cool, tinged with the scent of rain and soil. Birds were beginning to stir in the trees, their song faint but full of life. She closed her eyes, letting the wind brush her face. It felt like a touch from heaven, gentle, familiar, kind. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not for what had changed, but for what remained. The world was still imperfect, her body still frail, but her soul was no longer weary. "So this is peace," she thought. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of someone greater than it. The thought brought tears, but they were light as dew. She took her old scarf, the one that carried her husband's scent, and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders. "We're all right now," she said softly, speaking both to him and to herself. Her reflection in the window smiled back, lined, aged, but radiant. Something sacred lived in her again. As the first rays of sunlight touched her face, she breathed deeply once more. The air shimmered with warmth and quiet promise. Life, she realized, had not left her. It had simply been waiting for her to notice it again. And with that breath, she did. Margaret began to notice how the world seemed softer, as if the air itself had learned compassion. When she looked into the mirror now, she saw not only wrinkles and years, but traces of light behind her eyes. That light wasn't youth returning, it was peace taking root. It came from somewhere far deeper than her face, deeper even than memory. It was the quiet glow of being loved and knowing it. When she walked through her house, it no longer felt like a tomb of the past. It felt like a sanctuary, sacred not because of what it held, but because of who now dwelled there. Each corner shimmered with gentleness. Even the ticking clock, once cruel, now seemed faithful. She found herself whispering thanks for small things, for breath, for stillness, for light that stayed. Sometimes she would pause at the door, hand resting on the frame, and just smile. "You're still here," she'd say softly, not to anyone visible, but to the presence that never left. The words came easily now, flowing from gratitude instead of need. Her heart, once heavy with loss, had learned how to carry peace. What once was prayer had become conversation. She found herself humming again, old hymns she hadn't sung since her choir days. Her voice cracked, but it didn't matter. It filled the room with warmth, with life, with remembrance. She wasn't singing for an audience. She was singing for the one who listened in silence. And the air seemed to listen too, vibrating gently with grace. Each evening, when the sun slipped low, its last light bathed her face through the window. It made her skin glow faintly, almost like gold. She would close her eyes and let that warmth linger, whispering, "You are good, even now." The light faded, but the peace remained, glowing quietly behind her eyes, long after night returned. Spring crept in unnoticed that year, until the day Margaret opened her window and smelled the earth again. Something stirred in her, a memory of seeds, of soil, of mornings spent beside her husband, tending the roses. The garden had long been left to wildness, choked with weeds, the flowers gone to sleep, but now it called to her softly, and she answered. It took effort, more than she expected. Her knees ached, her back protested, yet she moved slowly, tenderly, touching the ground like one greeting an old friend. Beneath the brittle leaves, new green shoots were pushing through. Life, defiant and quiet, still waited there. She smiled, whispering, "You remembered me." It felt like a resurrection. Each day she returned to the garden, pulling weeds, loosening soil, humming softly to herself. The neighbors who once forgot to knock now waved from their porches, surprised to see her outside again. She waved back shyly, her hands still dirty from earth and joy. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She was blooming again too. She began to talk to the plants, the way she once had with her husband beside her. "He'd be proud of you," she told the roses one morning. A soft wind moved through the branches, gentle as a nod. She laughed, realizing she was no longer lonely when she spoke. Everything around her answered now. The sky, the earth, even silence itself. At sunset, she sat on the old bench and watched the light fade through the leaves. The air smelled of rain and grace. She closed her eyes, her hands resting on the soil she had revived, and felt something steady in her heart, a quiet pulse of belonging. The garden had not died. It had waited patiently for her return. That evening, as the stars appeared one by one, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. For years she had thought of writing to her husband, but the grief always stopped her hand. Tonight felt different. She didn't write to mourn. She wrote to speak. The pen moved slowly, the ink flowing like memory rediscovered. "My love," she began, "I thought I lost everything when you left, but I was wrong." The words came easily after that, like conversation resumed after a long pause. She told him about the garden, about the neighbors, about the voice that came when she was too tired to hope. She told him she had been found, not by people, but by peace. Tears blurred the page as she wrote, but they were gentle, cleansing. She wrote until her hand trembled, and her heart felt full. "I miss you," she ended softly, "but I am not alone anymore." He came. She placed the pen down and smiled at the letter, its edges curling slightly in the evening air. It didn't need to be sent. It had already reached where it needed to go. She folded it carefully, tied it with a small piece of ribbon, and placed it in the top drawer beside his old watch. The ticking of the clock seemed to echo from within that drawer, steady and kind. For the first time, the sound didn't ache. It felt like rhythm, a heartbeat, still shared. As she turned off the lamp, she looked toward the empty chair across from hers. "Good night, love," she whispered, her voice calm, peaceful, whole. And though the room was still, she could almost swear she heard a faint reply, not in sound, but in presence. Love, she realized, doesn't leave. It changes form. The days that followed were simple, tender, full of quiet grace. Margaret moved through them slowly, no longer waiting for something to happen. The miracle had already come, not in a flash, but in a gentle unfolding of peace. She watered her plants, brewed her tea, and thanked God for the soft rhythm of ordinary life. Every sunrise felt like a gift. She began to notice small blessings she had once overlooked. The warmth of her cup between her hands, the laughter of children playing outside, the hum of the wind at dusk. These were sermons in silence, reminders that love speaks most clearly through gentleness. She didn't need to search anymore. Everything holy found her now. Sometimes loneliness still came, uninvited but not unwelcome. She no longer fought it. Instead, she welcomed it like an old friend, offering it a seat by the window. "You may stay," she'd whisper, "but you won't stay long." And she was right. Loneliness came and went, but peace never left. Her faith had become quiet, not the kind shouted from pulpits, but the kind lived between heartbeats. She no longer asked why God had been silent for so long. She understood now. He had always been there, speaking in the stillness she feared. Love had never abandoned her. It had simply waited for her to listen. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked again, the first in years. Margaret opened the door with a smile that startled them both. Her eyes shone like sunlight after rain. "It's been too long," the woman said. "It has," Margaret answered gently, "but not too late." Morning broke quietly, spilling golden light across the small room. Margaret sat by the window as always, a shawl over her shoulders, her hands resting gently on her lap. The air felt soft, almost alive, carrying the scent of her garden through the open window. The world was simple, unchanged, yet she knew. Everything within her had been made new. Peace had settled, deep and unmoving. She no longer waited for voices or signs. She didn't need proof anymore. Faith had become the steady rhythm of her breathing, as natural as the rising sun. Every moment, however ordinary, now felt sacred. Even the quiet between her heartbeats seemed to hum with the presence she once thought was gone. Sometimes she spoke to him, not in words but in thought, a language of stillness only heaven understands. She would close her eyes and feel him near, not distant or grand, but tender, familiar, near as breath. "You stayed," she would whisper, and the silence answered like a nod. She knew now that love never leaves. It simply becomes light. The garden outside swayed gently in the morning breeze. The roses, once dry and forgotten, now bloomed again, vivid, alive, touched by unseen hands. Margaret smiled, watching the petals catch the sun. Life and loss had found peace together, no longer at war. She felt her husband's memory not as absence, but as belonging. As the clock ticked softly, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed, her breath calm. There was no fear, no loneliness, no ache left to name. Only quiet, holy, gentle, complete. The candle on her table flickered once more, its light steady as her heart. Peace had not come as thunder, it had come as presence, and it remained.